as you can see from the topic, we're gonna have an interesting discussion because for some reason, black people don't know their history for real. A lot of black people don't even understand that it was the Democrats who upheld slavery in the beginning because Abraham Lincoln and his party was the Republicans. And we have this misinterpretation of history because we don't read or we don't study things. You know what I mean? And this is why they're trying to take uh, critical race theory out of school and trying to change the history of this country as it relates to black people. Like a lot of people think, for some reason, that the Democrats were friends to Martin Luther King and black people's quest for liberation. And that's not the truth. The Democrats wanted to maintain the status quo as well, with black people being second-class citizens. If you look at the politics today, they voted in Biden and Kamala Harris. Ever since they've been in office, their whole thing been to replace the workforce with Mexicans and give them the jobs and the benefits that black people are entitled to in this country. So, as you come to the building, I want you to like, share, and subscribe, and pay attention to what I'm finna show you. And this comes from the new book about Martin Luther King, A Life, because people got it twisted. So this is under the Fair Usage Act and for commentary purposes. Let me start this for y'all so y'all can hear this.
Malcom X on his autobiography. The transcript shows how Haley misquoted and even made up part of King's response. In fact, King never said Malcolm has done himself or our people a great disservice. And King's comment about fiery, demagogic oratory was not related to Malcolm X. To talk about all of this, we're joined in Chicago by Jonathan Eig. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Jonathan. This is an epic work. Congratulations on this.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Now, the first thing that she was saying was how they misquoted things that Martin Luther King said as it related to Malcolm X to create a division. It's come to find out that Martin Luther King never said any of these things as it relates to Malcolm X and the movement. But I want you to understand that it was the federal government under COINTELPRO that was bugging Martin Luther King's room, was slandering Martin Luther King, exposing him. Then you're going to find out some interesting things that you probably didn't know. Did you know that Martin Luther King suffered from chronic depression? And as a young person, he tried to commit suicide at least twice. And he was hospitalized for a mental breakdown. And the whole thing was J. Edgar Hoover and the federal government were trying to make Martin Luther King commit suicide. Pay attention and listen to this.
Years of research and writing. Why don't we begin where I left off? On this expose around what Martin Luther King really thought of Malcolm X. Talk about the significance of how Alex Haley shaped the narrative for so many decades and who Haley was.
Alex Haley was one of the best-known African-American journalists of his era. He wrote for a lot of mainstream white publications like Reader's Digest and Playboy. And the Playboy interview that he did with Martin Luther King was the longest published interview that King ever gave. So it had significant impact. It reached a lot of white readers who were not otherwise going to be exposed to such a long interview with King. And it's because of the comments that King made or supposedly made about Malcolm X. It's been handed down for decades, for generations, that this is what King actually thought about Malcolm X. And it was, as you pointed out in the introduction, largely fabricated.
And talk about how you found this out and what you understand King really thought about Malcolm X. They actually only met in person once, right? In Washington, D.C. Although Malcolm X did go to Selma and talk about what he said to Martin Luther King's wife, Coretta Scott King.
Yes, the men only met once, and Malcolm did go. He was speaking in Tuskegee, and some students told him that King was in Selma. They could drive there and be there, within hours. So Malcolm X got in the car and drove to Selma. Did not get to meet King because he was in jail, but he did sit next to Coretta Scott King at a church rally and said to Coretta, let your husband know that I'm here, that I support him, and that maybe it's helpful to him in a way. If everybody knows that I'm the alternative, perhaps they'll be more willing to listen to Dr. King. And that's the truth. The truth of their relationship, as James Baldwin wrote, is that by the time of their deaths, they were pretty much indistinguishable in their philosophies. That may be a bit of an exaggeration, but they were definitely moving toward each other. And this quote in Playboy really did a disservice. It really misrepresented their relationship.
Okay, I'm gonna stop right there. Now they saying that the statements that they publicized as it related to how Martin Luther King felt about Malcolm X was completely fabricated. And then they also not telling you that toward the end of Martin Luther King's life, he had said that he was integrating black people into a burning building. Martin Luther King had just said also that the biggest threat to the liberation of black people were the white liberals, because the white liberals were closet racist. They were doing the same thing that the Republicans was doing, trying to maintain the status quo. But they do it with a smile. So what the Democratic Party did is create friction between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King in the media. But it was all fabricated. I want you to listen to some more of this.
One of the things that I do in any time I find a really good interview with the subject of a book that I'm working on is I'll go to the archives and try to find the original tapes or the original transcript of that interview to see what was left out. And that's really all I was doing when I went looking for the Alex Haley transcript of his interview with Martin Luther King. I wanted to see what got left out because, you can never really publish the full interview. You have to choose the best parts. But as I was reading through the transcript, I was shocked to discover that whole parts of it were moved around so that answers to questions were changed in their meaning, and some sections were completely fabricated. And King never said that he thought Malcolm's fiery oratory was doing a disservice to the black community. In fact, he said that about the Nation of Islam, but not specifically about Malcolm. And when asked about Malcolm, King actually expressed great open-mindedness. He said, I don't agree when Malcolm X calls for violence, but I'm also not so arrogant to think that I have all the answers. And he's suggesting in this interview, the part that wasn't published, that he's open-minded to learning more and to talking more to Malcolm. That's one of the great things about King. He was always interested in listening to the people who disagreed with him.
So, if you can talk about that kind of research that you did, Jonathan, and why you chose to do a profile of King, not just a profile, an epic work. Talk about the other biographies that you wrote and how that brought you to King at this critical moment when, Harry Belafonte just died. He was 96. Dr. King, of course, would have been in his 90s, and what that means about those around him who knew him best.
About 10 years ago, when I was working on my Muhammad Ali biography, I was interviewing people who knew Ali and also knew Martin Luther King, and I was asking them about the couple of occasions when King and Ali met. I was speaking to people like Harry Belafonte, Dick Gregory, Andrew Young, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and as I began talking to them, I found myself just asking a lot of questions about King. I was curious what he was like, and that's when it occurred to me that in the last, 40, 50 years or so, we've turned King into kind of a two-dimensional figure. And I think especially with the advent of the national holiday, he's become kind of a Hallmark card, and we've watered down his vision. And these men were telling me that they considered King a radical as Malcolm X in many ways. And the public image of him has changed so much that I felt like this was a great opportunity to write a book that would correct that image, and also an opportunity to write that book while so many people who knew King were still alive. And I traveled the country over the last 6 years interviewing folks not just like the ones I mentioned, but also Juanita Abernathy, Dr. June Dobbs-Butts, Reverend James Lawson, Reverend Bernard Lafayette, and asking them, what was it like to be around King? What was his message? How have we lost sight of the real man? I wanted to write a more intimate portrait, and it had been, a good 35 years since the last King biography had been published, so I felt like this was an urgent mission, really.
Jonathan, I want to get to his early years, the descendant of enslaved people, but I also want to talk about what you discovered in the last years from declassified FBI documents, and also this personal secretary of Lyndon Baines Johnson kept her own archive, and how that wasn't released until recently. I want to talk about FBI surveillance from the Kennedys to Johnson, and how it wasn't just surveillance, but proactive attempting to drive Dr. Martin Luther King to suicide.
It began with the authorization by Robert F. Kennedy to begin to surveil King. They began by putting wiretaps on some of his associates' phones. Eventually, they started wiretapping King's home and office phones, and then they also began to put listening devices in his hotel rooms. Originally, the rationale for that was that they were concerned he was associating with communists and former communists. When it became clear that King was not interested at all in communists, and the communists were not influencing the civil rights movement in any way that moved them toward communist beliefs, they acknowledged that, but by then they had become obsessed with his personal life and trying to catch him in affairs with other women other than Coretta, his wife. So it became really a personal vendetta.
I'm gonna stop right there again, because it's important that you heard them say that it was the federal government's intent to drive Martin Luther King to commit suicide. Did you hear that? And I want you to understand why they wanted Martin Luther King to commit suicide.
Fueled in part by the racism in the FBI, fueled in part by the insecurities of J. Edgar Hoover, who resisted and really raged when King criticized the FBI for being racist. And then it became really the personal obsession of people like Hoover and LBJ, who I think just had a prurient interest in keeping tabs on King's personal life.
And talk about how they weaponized that. I mean, you talk extensively about Martin Luther King dealing with depression, and I think this also goes to demystifying an icon. It doesn't take away any of his power, but for people who wonder if they themselves could make a difference in the world, who suffer from depression, from his early sort of half-hearted attempts at suicide as a child to being institutionalized, and yet accomplishing so much. Take us on that trajectory.
I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that our heroes have flaws, and if we expect our heroes to be perfect, nobody will ever rise to the occasion. Nobody will even try. And King was deeply flawed. He as you mentioned, he attempted suicide twice as a teenager, jumping from a second-story window of his home when he was upset about first an injury suffered by his grandmother, and then later by her death. And when he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was hospitalized at the time for what he called anxiety, but for what Coretta described as depression. He was hospitalized numerous times throughout his life because the pressure had just gotten to him so badly. And of course the FBI knew about this and attempted to weaponize it, as you say. They took his personal life, and reported on it, distributed that information not only to the President of the United States, but to members of Congress and to members of the media, hoping that somebody would go public.
Now I'm going to stop right there. From what they're saying, the federal government knew that Martin Luther King had suffered from depression ever since a teenager. They knew he had jumped out the window and tried to hurt himself when his grandmother died, and they knew that he had been hospitalized for chronic depression. So the whole thing about bringing up affairs and trying to catch him in affairs was to get his wife to divorce him and him lose his family, and ultimately commit suicide and destroy himself due to the fact he suffered from depression most of his life. Then when they tell you that it was Robert Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, the Democrats, who actually put all the wiretaps and actually gave J. Edgar Hoover the task of slandering Martin Luther King to the point till they broke the man. These the Democrats. And they doing it to this day.
Public with it and destroy his marriage, destroy his reputation, and essentially destroy the civil rights movement. At one point, they even planned for a replacement for King, choosing Samuel Pierce to become the next leader of the civil rights movement once they managed to get King out of the way. So this was a deliberate, extended, and really mean-spirited campaign, driven not just by their fear of King, not just by their fear of a race, of a black man rising to prominence, but really driven by a fear of losing the power as was enjoyed by white people primarily at that time. They wanted to maintain the existing power structure.
And when you talk about distributing the surveillance transcripts, when they were listening to him in hotel rooms, when they were listening to him on the telephone, talk about the role of the media. In one sense, being called heroic, for example, the New York Times, for returning those documents without reporting on them, but not exposing the fact that he was being surveilled and wiretapped.
This is one of the great mysteries of the civil rights era. Why didn't anybody report on the fact that our government, the FBI, was in fact surveilling private citizens, not just King, but many of his closest associates? And as we later discovered in 1971, when some of these FBI documents were stolen during a break-in, that the FBI was conducting a massive campaign of trying to disrupt protest leaders, trying to disrupt activists who were engaged in peacefully, for the most part, trying to bring change and expand the system of democracy. But the real interesting part of the story to me is that dozens of reporters were being leaked these documents. Dozens of reporters were being beseeched by the FBI to publish the news of King's personal life, to write about his sexual affairs. And they patted themselves on the back for not reporting that story, protecting King's privacy. But none of them picked up what should have been the much bigger story, which was the surveillance in the first place. Why was our government doing this? Why was it engaged in this kind of conduct against a private citizen? In fact, one of our great moral leaders.
And talk about how that went back to the Kennedys. Both President John F. Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, what was their relationship with King? On the one hand, calling Coretta, being deeply concerned about him being jailed, and on the other hand, authorizing the wiretaps.
Martin Luther King did not endorse JFK, but a lot of people felt like his tacit endorsement, his words of approval for Kennedy really helped Kennedy swing the election. And after that, King was really disappointed that Kennedy didn't move more quickly to enact civil rights legislation. He felt like Kennedy was hemming and hawing, playing politics, trying to preserve white votes in the South, not wanting to take any chances. So the relationship was a complicated one. At the same time, it was...
Now I'm gonna stop you here, because I know a lot of you who got older parents or grandparents, they always show you the picture of Martin Luther King with Robert Kennedy and Jack Kennedy, as if Martin Luther King was aligned with the Democratic Party. But as you can see from the files, that King never endorsed Kennedy. And the Kennedys are the ones who actually did the surveillance on Martin Luther King and had the press change the words about Malcolm X so that they could maintain the votes in the South. And the reason all this is relevant, if you look what they're doing in Florida, and you look what they're doing around the country as far as critical race theory and changing history and changing the narrative, while at the same time replacing the black labor force with Mexican immigrants, you can see that it is an attempt to really deconstruct and destroy the black community. How you going to give all these immigrants all these benefits and more money than you giving the black citizens in the communities that you dumping them in? It's a replacement. They giving them no taxes, giving them $7,000 a month, and helping them and putting them in black communities, which is really changing the voting demographic and giving Mexicans more power and more influence in this country and in our communities than us. You see the Koreans got the hair salons, the Arabs got the stores and the junkyards and the car lots, and now they're finna replace the whole labor force with Mexican immigrants. These are the tricks that the Democratic Party been using ever since they lost the war. And I'm talking about the Civil War, because it's the Democrats who was supporting slavery. Listen to some more.
The Kennedys who authorized the FBI to begin these wiretaps. The Kennedys were at first truly concerned that King's connections to communists might have damaging political effects. That if the news got out that King had these former Communist Party members and perhaps some current Communist Party members in his circle, that it would damage any chances they had of passing civil rights legislation. And the Kennedys warned King and asked him to get rid of these people. King ended up getting rid of one of them, but keeping his relationship with the other, because he truly believed that this was a good man and that his former ties to communists were irrelevant. So King was not playing politics. He was doing what he believed was the right thing morally, standing by a friend and an important ally. And the Kennedys didn't seem to understand that. They didn't understand why he wasn't more concerned with the political optics.
And then going on to Johnson. The fact that he understood he had to keep these memos of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover secret, who was sending as many as one a week, detailing Dr. King's private life, who knows, filled with facts, filled with lies, and putting this through a whole different channel with the private secretary of Lyndon Baines Johnson. And when that...
I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to put the entire video in my community section. The reason this is relevant is because the Democrats are playing the same divide and conquer politics that they've always played. You see Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, ever since they've been in office, it's been about gay rights, immigration, passing bills for other ethnic groups, while the black people that put them in there are left hung out to dry. They're cutting their benefits and making life even harder for black people, even though black people are their #1 supporters. So you have to know your history, and you have to see why these things are important, because Martin Luther King and Malcolm X are icons, and they're distorting the history because the youth don't read. The youth don't read. They get all their information from their friends or YouTube or whatever, but they don't read enough to know that these politics that are being played are really anti-black racism, especially from the Democrats. I mean, at what point in time do black people have to really realize that they have no friends? Just like the Black-Brown coalition with the Mexicans, no Mexican organizations ever stand with black people. No other ethnic groups. But black people are always trying to unite with other people instead of uniting with themselves. You know what I mean? That's why you had them house Negroes like Roland Martin and Boyce Watkins, and there's a lot of them out there that want you to blindly follow Democratic policies, but they don't tell you the type of things that the Democratic politicians have done to black people. So I'm going to end on this note, and I'm going to do more commentary on this as I look more into what came out in these FBI files. So like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Tell me what you think about what you just learned in the comments about what they was really doing to Martin Luther King. Peace.